right, thank you all for being here. My name is Becky Grady. I'm going to be talking to you about how politics shapes the way we define racism. And the reason that I have John Stewart up on this slide right there is because this research was actually inspired by a segment on The Daily Show called Racist or Not Racist. And in it, they brought up various items from the news. For example, one was a child wore a Halloween costume of a KKK outfit, and they had panelists debate whether or not this action was racist. And every time the non-white panelists called out the situation as racist, while the clueless white guy continued to say every time that it was not. And this got us thinking in our lab about whether anybody studied this a little bit more scientifically than this. And it turns out that people have. So there has been research in the past about what leads people to judge something as racist or not, including their race and attitudes, but one kind of underexplored area was political ideology. You know, increasingly in the news, we seem to be seeing a lot of these issues that are coming up, a lot of tension, a lot of events that have a lot of controversy around them. And it really seems like there's a political divide in this country between liberals and conservatives about whether they decide whether something is racist or not. And so we wanted to study that a little bit more carefully. So in my first study, I did a pretty straightforward study. I got a few hundred people in an online survey to read a list of 50 actions. And we just asked the question, is this racist? Yes or no? I'll be going through some examples of what those items were. And we found that there were very big differences in the number of items rated as racist between liberals and conservatives. So on average, liberals rated 67% of the items as racist, whereas conservatives rated 48% of them as racist. And these differences were not accounted for just by race, gender, or attitudes of the person making the judgment. The politics still really mattered. So as an example, there were some items that everybody agreed was racist. There was pretty close to universal agreement on disallowing certain races from entering a store. Everybody can pretty much agree that that's racist. And we also threw in a couple that everybody could pretty much agree were not racist, like buying a white smartphone over a black smartphone. But many of them had a lot of disagreement. There was much wider differences on something like wearing clothing with an image of the Confederate flag. Here we saw that 80% of the liberals thought that it was racist, but only 36% of conservatives did. The item with the single biggest difference between the two groups in this study was enacting laws requiring a photo ID to vote, which was in the news a lot a couple years ago. And so more than half of the liberals, 54%, thought that this was racist, and only 4% of conservatives did. So my question is, what is so different about these items? Why can we agree so easily on some items, and there's such a strong disagreement about others? So I really want to know what's special about something like voter ID laws. Well, one thing is that a voter ID law technically treats everybody the same. Everybody has to show a voter ID to vote. So on the one hand, it's treating everybody the same. On the other hand, it disproportionately affects some groups more than others. So white people are more likely to have an ID than minorities, and therefore are more likely to have the necessary documentation to be able to vote. So that could be one of these key differences. And so I looked through the literature more, and there's a couple different definitions that people have used in past literature to talk about some of these differences. So on the one hand, you have an individualized definition of racism. So that's where you have a person is racist. A person, can hold personal prejudice, you discriminate against somebody on the basis of race, you use kind of this intentional behavior against somebody. But on the other hand, you have a more institutional definition of racism. So this is just where a society or a system generally privileges one race over another or others. And this can include disparate effect. So this is something that treats everybody the same, but affects people differently based on race. And this is something that it really brings into account kind of the historical context of a country or a system, and can be a little structural in nature as opposed to the individualized. So in my next study, I wanted to look at this a little bit more carefully. I wanted to really test some of these ideas to see if liberals and conservatives are leaning more towards one or these other conclusions. So in the next study, once again, got a few hundred online adults to take a survey. And they read scenarios which varied on a few things a little bit more carefully. So we varied in these different situations they read, whether the behavior was intentional, what setting the behavior took place in, whether it was a differential treatment or different effect, and the race of the person being discriminated against. I'd love to tell you about all of those, and if you're curious, you can come ask me afterwards, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on the discrimination process, whether it was a differential treatment, where you treat somebody differently based on race, or a disparate effect, like the voter ID law, where you have a policy that affects people differently based on race. And so what I found is that when it's for a differential treatment based on race, across different kinds of settings, across intention, liberals still thought that more of the actions that they read were racist than conservatives did. But the majority of both groups did think that the action was racist. On the other hand, for the disparate effect, the difference was much larger. So more than half of liberals still thought that these disparate effect scenarios were racist, whereas far fewer conservatives did. So this is something that we can, people are really judging these scenarios differently. We also just ask people, all right, what is your definition of racism? So we asked them both with the scenarios and then just kind of asked them what they thought. And so for conservatives, they had their top choice in definition was more of this individualized definition, believing that one race is superior to another race or races. And their other definitions were similarly individualized. For liberals, on the other hand, the more common response was systematically or structurally privileging one race over another or others. And we had questions throughout the survey about asking how they treat different policies that affect people differently based on race. And we saw these very large differences based on political ideology, even controlling for the other demographic factors that I talked about. And so how might that affect your perception of how much racism is still a problem today? As there seemed to be a very big disagreement here. And unsurprisingly, it has a very big effect on how often you think racism still happens today. So, liberals think that in this sample, we're thinking that racism happens quite a lot against non-white people and not nearly as much against white people, whereas for conservatives, it was much closer together, which kind of makes sense if you start from that definition, because anybody can hold personal prejudice against somebody of any group, but this kind of systematic privilege is something that really can only target the people not in power in a particular country. And so this can really help us explain a lot of these differences that we see in everyday life. If you only think that this is what racism is, if that's your definition of racism, you might have a hard time understanding why other people think that this is racism. And in fact, when somebody else calls it racist, you might think they're just playing the race card. And it can really, really show us that when we need to focus on these definitions, we need to figure out kind of the root cause of these disagreements before we can have any kind of meaningful discourse and try to come to some kind of agreement. So I want to thank my advisors, my collaborator Chen, and my lab mates. And I just want to, while I answer some questions, I'm just going to leave this quote up, which I think really nicely illustrates two different definitions that you might have when it comes to racism.
So I'm kind of curious about how you measure liberal versus conservative. So when you ask people in like the NES, National Election Survey, are you liberal or conservative, people generally don't say they're liberal, right? So usually what you get is the most extreme liberals, and most everybody else that says they're conservative. So how do you measure it?
Sure. So we measured it in a couple different ways. So the way I split it up in this, we gave people a scale of how liberal or conservative they are from 1 to 7. So people that were on one half of the scale that said they were either very conservative, conservative, or slightly conservative would be called conservative. And then the same thing on the other half of the scale. And there were actually more liberals than conservatives in this sample, although we got a large enough number so we had a decent amount of both. I also looked at it based on whether people affiliated as Democrat or Republican, and the same results came out. And also looked at, if you just look at it as a continuous measure of conservativeness, the results still come out the same way. Yes?
So when you ran the regression controlling for like these other demographic, biographic voters, what was the unique effect of political affiliation or political identity?
Like the beta value, or what?
Yeah.
I don't remember offhand. I can certainly find that out for you. It was a certainly significant predictor. I don't remember the exact value. Yeah.
So so you said it was an online survey. Was it just like SurveyMonkey or something like that, or because
the survey was built in Qualtrics. The survey was done at a site called yourmorals.org, and it's a place where people come to the survey and they just take various surveys about their political attitudes, moral behavior, and any kind of judgments relating to morality and personality, and then at the end they kind of get results about how they compare to other people. So people like to come back, they like to see how they did compare to others. They get to show like, oh, what did other people think of this question versus how you answered it. So it's a site specific to surveys like that.
Okay.
Yes?
So disparate impact is more difficult to understand probably for some people. Do you try to do the same kind of survey this time, explaining what it means when they say if you don't have a uniform vote, and see if you get the same result?
Sure. So one thing is we never actually explain what disparate impact is. So when I'm talking about disparate impact, I think you're exactly right. It's a lot harder to understand. It needs a little bit more explanation. What we do is we craft these scenarios that build on that. So for example, they never see the words disparate impact. What they see is, they get a scenario, for example, the differential treatment, they get a scenario where it says, in the hiring setting, a manager is interviewing lots of people and he deliberately picks white people over similarly qualified non-white people. How racist is that? So that would, versus the disparate effect, we don't explain exactly what that term means, but what we say is that, oh, the hiring manager has put in place a new policy to interview people, and it happens that white people are scoring high, getting better scores on this policy than non-white people, even if they had, similar background coming into it. And so we don't explain necessarily what that is. We give them scenarios that kind of get to that. And we ask questions like, if a policy treats everybody the same but affects people differently based on race, is that racist? So we try to kind of get at these point-by-point questions rather than giving them the definition to see, whether people are saying yes or no to like a series of questions that get at that kind of disparate effect.
Great, I think we have to cut it there. Just make sure.